Thanks so much, Professor Ackley. That was perfect. It sets us up really nicely for our next session, which is about ethical culture, defined and measured. I think the importance of contextual influences is very clear, and we are very lucky to have two fantastic speakers on this topic. I'd like to introduce Linda Trevino and Brian Beeghly. Linda is an ethical systems collaborator and a distinguished professor of organizational behavior and ethics at Penn State. She's also the leader of our ethical culture measurement working group, and she's going to talk about the survey that John mentioned that we launched about 2 weeks ago, and we have some very preliminary pilot data that Linda will go through. And Brian Beeghly is the Vice President for Ethics and Compliance at Johnson Controls, and he's also a member of the Ethical Systems Advisory Board, so we're very thankful to have him as part of our community. In the interest of time, I'm keeping bios short, so I'll turn over the floor to both of you, and look forward to the discussion.
Where's the? Oh, there. Thank you. Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah, I'm okay? Good. Well, thanks so much for inviting me and us to do this. Brian and I spent some time last evening having a wonderful Turkish dinner. So if you don't like anything else we say, you can ask us where you can go get a great Turkish dinner. So I think we will be building upon what others have already said. I wanted to thank John for creating this group. As you've seen already, he's a very optimistic guy. He's all about changing the world, and every time I tell him about the obstacles I've run into in the last 30 years, he tells me, but we can change the world. So, and I really love that about you. You're always pulling me back. But we also heard a little bit from Nick. John's a little bit of a weird guy. I mean, he comes up with these stories, and you only heard one about the cannibalism. But he's got a raft of them, and I don't know what his dreams are like. I've always wondered. Something over a drink sometime, you will have to tell me the story. Well, I have been in this business for quite a while, and I do remember back earlier to when this culture issue came up. I think it was 2003 when the Sentencing Commission decided to start talking about culture. And so instead of just having a program where you check off your 7, meeting the requirements of the sentencing guidelines, they started to talk about the fact that you didn't only have to do that, but you had to show that these were somehow baked into your culture. And same reaction, everybody kind of went, ugh, what's that? And I actually remember a meeting where we had somebody from the Sentencing Commission come and sit in the middle of a group, and everybody was waiting to hear what their definition of culture was, and the truth was she didn't know either. And it was really up to everybody to figure that out. So here we are today, still trying to figure that out, and our goal is to try to help you figure that out. We're going to try to keep this kind of informal. We're going to go back and forth between me and Brian, the academic, and the corporate person. And we encourage you to ask questions during the course of the presentation. So let me just start by saying that I want to introduce the team that has been working on this. I'm trying to remember how long we've been working on this. It's been a while.
4 or 5 months.
Maybe those of you who are on the team, would you just stand up real quick so people know who you are in case they want to ask you questions? Yes. Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much. And some members of the team, like Sean over there, have been working on this, the data, up through yesterday afternoon. I'm on the bus from Pennsylvania, and I'm getting emails about, well, here are the slides. So we've been working on this. We have brand new data from one company that we're going to share with you in just a minute. I've been thinking about this ethical culture stuff for a long time. I've understood as a social psychologist that there was more than just bad people. It was more of a story about context, or at least the combination of the two. And so I've been thinking about it for a long time. And there are many different ways that we could conceptualize ethical culture, and this is just one that I've come up with. I like to think about ethical culture as being a combination of formal systems, and many of those formal systems are the things that are part of compliance programs. You know, they have to do with the things you do to select people, the policies and codes that you have, the codes of conduct, the training programs that everybody invests a fortune in, the things you do in your performance management system, and on and on. But as we're going to see, equally if not more important are the informal things that you do. The people who are role models in the organization, who people look up to, the myths and stories that people tell. I always tell students when they're looking at organizations to join, I say, ask people what are the stories people tell about this organization? You know, if you were to tell me one thing about what it's like to work here, what would you tell me? And you can learn a lot. What's the language that people use in the organization? Is it okay to use the language of ethics? Those are the kinds of things. And then secondly, one of the most important things, and we've heard this word before today already, is this idea of alignment. So all of the pieces need to fit together. I have been recently, you see my little garden up there, it's not just because I live in rural central Pennsylvania. And as I was thinking about talking to you about this, I was thinking, I don't know, I'm in New York. Do most of these people live in apartments and they're not going to get it? So I don't know. This is going to go over. But I started to think, maybe it's because of all the weeding I've been doing lately, but I've been thinking about a garden as a metaphor for culture. Because there are so many different pieces that have to work together. And most importantly, it requires tending. You cannot stop. You cannot let it just sit there. If you do, the bad guys, and that's what I spent last weekend doing, partly, pulling those bad guys, because we don't use pesticides, out of my garden. So you've got to kind of keep after it. And that's one of the stories I think that we have to tell about ethical culture. Okay.
And I like that analogy. I mean, of course, at a company like Johnson Controls, we're doing gardening on a more industrial scale because we're working across 100 plus countries, multiple cultures. We've got different parts of our business. I can just maybe preface real quick. I mean, the work that's being done here by Ethical Systems is extremely important. And I'm really excited to be a part of this organization, and I know there are other ethics and compliance officers as well who are getting more engaged. I think historically, this whole area of culture, to your point earlier, was kind of relegated to the phrase tone at the top. And most compliance programs spent the majority of their time focusing on what I kind of call the real hard aspects of a compliance program. Third-party due diligence, policies and procedures, internal controls, but the whole concept of studying and understanding culture and behavior was just kind of relegated to a catchphrase. And I think the point that you made about the government representative not really understanding what culture was. But I think more and more we're realizing we can only get so far in our organizations and in our ethics and compliance programs by only focusing on the hard aspects of compliance programs. They're important, we have to do them, they're a critical component, but I think we're also searching for something more, and this is what Ethical Systems helps to deliver, especially the work, the academic work, the research that's being done. It allows us now to turn our attention a little bit more to the behavior piece, to the culture piece. And Nick, in your presentation when you started talking about, you know, how do you integrate that ethics culture, that mindset into simple things like the hiring process, right? The promotion process, the incentives. it sounds simple, but to do that in a company that has over 100,000 employees, operates in over 100 countries around the world, is an extremely challenging endeavor. And so part of the reason I'm a part of this organization is what I get to do is benefit from the research that you all do, but then what I have to do is kind of turn it around and operationalize that. So how do I take that and make it work for a for-profit company and make it relevant and make it real?
Yeah, so we're going to be talking a little bit more about that. It's more about more than tone at the top. It's also tone at the middle, that supervisory leadership is really important. That's going to come up in a minute. So, so the next question, if culture is this sort of complicated thing, which that's the bad news, there is no silver bullet. There's no one thing that you can do. How can you measure it? And we have talked about that in our telephone conference calls. One way is through surveys, and that's what I'm going to be talking to you about in a moment. But there are other ways. There are things like focus groups, there are exit interviews. Social media is providing new opportunities to learn about your company, whether you like it or not. Glassdoor is one that I know my students use quite a lot. Data mining is, I think, we really haven't mined that very well yet, but it's a great opportunity. And something I know they're working on here is implicit association tests. So, ask us about those things later at lunch and during the course of the conference. What we're going to talk about today is the ethical systems culture survey that we've been working on. So as John mentioned in the introduction, one of the things that we would like to do is to create a survey instrument that companies can use that's out there, that's available, and the hope is that you will use it, those of you who are from companies, and that you will use it to learn about yourselves and then to make the changes that are indicated by the information that you get. So,
if I can just add real quick. So this whole area of measuring culture and really around measuring the effectiveness of our compliance programs. I don't know how many of you in the audience are from for-profit companies like myself. Anybody, or is this not like the holy grail of your program? I mean, boards are asking for this information. The C-suite is asking for this information. The business unit level presidents and leadership are typically asking for this. So how do we know that what we're doing, all of this effort that we're putting into this, how do we know that it's effective? How do we know that we have a strong ethical culture? How do we know where there's gaps? So if you're like me, you're spending a fair amount of time kind of looking at this, and going back to Dr. Trevino's original statement, there's really, I think what we're finding is there's no magic bullet here. We don't expect that there's going to be one data point that we're going to look at and somehow miraculously that's going to tell us everything that we need to know. I think what we're finding is it's a combination of data points. And what we refer to as data triangulation. We think cultural surveys play a very big and important part of that piece of the puzzle, but also so do our internal audit results, so do our control audits, so do our other engagement surveys that we do with employees, and there's other data points that we have as an organization that we look at to try and get, I guess, what I would call a more complete picture about what's going on within our organizations. And we can't underestimate also that face-to-face, that one-on-one piece where we're sitting down with the business leaders, we're sitting down with employees, and we're having conversations about what's working well, what's not working well.
yeah, I probably should have mentioned helpline data.
Helpline data.
Helpline data, that kind of data is also very useful. So we started from what we know about ethical culture, my model, other models, and the formal structural elements. And in every one of these cases, I want you to keep in mind that these are employees' perceptions. So we're sending out a survey to our employees and we're asking them for their perceptions of the culture in our organization. And so we want to know from them, do they perceive that we care about ethics when we recruit people? Do we care about it in performance evaluation systems? Is this something, or is it, you know, all about how many widgets they sold or what other bottom line outcomes? How do they perceive the organization's response when something bad happens, when somebody engages in misconduct, when somebody commits a violation? Do they think that the organization's really trying to find the misconduct? And do they feel that some of the formal things that we're doing, like having a code of conduct, is that actually playing out in the day-to-day life of the organization, or do we just hand that out once a year? Everybody, you know, throws it away or sticks it in a drawer and forgets where it is and never pays any attention to it. So those are the kinds of perceptions that we're interested in. On the informal side, there's a ton of stuff that we want to know. So what we have learned from a whole lot of research over the years is that perceptions of fairness, fair treatment, how people are paid, how people are treated interpersonally, those sorts of things are extremely important. Perceptions of trust in the organization. Perceptions that leaders are ethical leaders and not abusive supervisors. An ethics officer said to me many years ago that if she could just rid her organization of abusive supervisors, she feels like she would have solved a lot of the problems. And the research is beginning to bear out. And we'll talk a little bit more about, let me know, by the way, if you need definitions of any of these. We actually had a slide with a lot of definitions that that was too much. John's like, get rid of that stuff, okay. So, you know, are we incorporating ethics into our decision making every day? Do people feel, there's something we call moral efficacy, do people feel like they actually, if they want to do the right thing, they actually can in this organization, that feels possible, they feel enabled to do that? Is there a sense of collective empathy? We heard about empathy a minute ago, you know, is that a part of the culture? Are people ethically aware? Do they see ethical issues that are in front of them? What's the climate like? Is it a climate where people are caring and take care of each other, or is it a climate where everybody's out for themselves, a self-interested climate? Is there pressure to compromise ethics, openness to discussing ethics? Obedience to authority is an interesting one. Is this a kind of do what you're told culture, or is it one where people are expected to take accountability for their behavior? And then the last one's really important. Perceptions of ethics is part of the reward structure. So is it possible to get ahead in this organization without being ethical? You know, how do people think about that?
And I think woven through all of these is that concept of speak-up culture that we talk about.
Yes.
And how important that is to not only an effective compliance program, but to an overall health of an organization. And, you know, the way I think about it, and for those of you who don't know, my background is primarily in the risk management area, running large property casualty insurance programs for big multinationals. And this concept of speak-up culture is not just an ethics and compliance, and I know we had a good discussion about this yesterday, but if I think about it in the context of health and safety programs, to me it's a very similar speak-up culture, right? We want employees to talk about dangerous conditions. Health and safety programs have moved from a traditional focus on recordable injuries and lost workday, lost time injuries, to focusing on things like near misses, unsafe acts, unsafe conditions. To me, that's a proactive manifestation of a speak-up culture. But even more important to that, or I probably shouldn't say more important, but equally important to that, is if you think about how a lot of large companies, especially those in the manufacturing sector, operate, they operate off of lean methodologies, lean principles. The Toyota way is probably what you're most familiar with. One of the central tenets of Lean is that problems are good, and it's only through the identification of problems, resolving problems, that we become better as an organization. So we try and latch on to those kinds of analogies with our business leaders because A, they're already doing it, and B, it resonates with them. And it's not seen as, okay, do your day job, get the product out the door, and then, oh, by the way, now let's talk about ethics and compliance. It really goes back to the comment you made earlier, right? How do we, from a culture behavioral standpoint, take these aspects of speak up culture, organizational justice, and embed them into what the business already does day to day, so that it's seen as real and tangible, as opposed to this, okay, it's time out everybody, now it's time for ethical session 101. Yes, there will be some of that. Yes, we need to talk about that. Yes, we need to have some formal components around that. But I think part of what we're trying to do as organizations is really look at that informal piece and how the organization runs day to day and say, how can we embed things into that piece so that it becomes more real, salient, social, and tangible?
All right, well, the important question is, what are the outcomes that we're interested in? So these are all the sort of predictor side. What are the outcomes that we're interested in measuring? So we have others, but these are probably the most important ones. So one is a kind of overall perception on the part of employees of how much unethical behavior they perceive is actually occurring in the organization over a certain period of time. Usually because we assume that most organizations are not horrible places where a lot of bad things are happening, we'll say over the past year. Okay, and get a sense of that. We also have very specific. So we have one overall question. We also have very specific questions, and we have a long list of those that organizations can choose from. And in this particular case that we're talking about, I'm trying to remember how many there actually were in the front. Do you remember? Yeah, the long list. Was it 15? No, 20. 20. Okay, so this organization chose 20 very specific behaviors, everything from lying to customers to taking time off from work when you really weren't allowed to do so. So from some more minor things to some very major things. So when you're analyzing these data, you can look at it in a very sort of general way, or you can actually look at very specific behaviors. We also asked employees, whether they believe that the average employee would report a violation that they observed. One of the reasons we ask it this way is that if we ask them whether they would, they're probably going to be much too optimistic, I think. So we've learned that it's better to ask them what they think the average person would do. It's probably a better indication. Would they use the telephone line or whatever the system is for help or reporting? Do they think that better decisions are being made in the organization because of the ethics and compliance activities in the organization? Do they think that there is better problem solving because of that? So what are the benefits of an ethical culture that we know about already from past research? Previous research, and this actually comes from the National Business Ethics Survey primarily, is that having more formal program elements actually is beneficial. So all of those things that you folks are doing do make a difference. So having training programs and codes and all of those other things that you do outlines. But research, academic research, various kinds of research, sources tell us, they all tell us the same thing, and that is that the informal side is more important. That's what people pay more attention to, and if you think back to the model that I presented earlier, this idea of alignment, if those two aren't aligned, people are going to pay more attention to the informal side. They're going to pay more attention to what seems to be going on every day around them. This goes back to Nick's presentation. The context around them is going to be much more influential than that ethics training program that they went to once last year. So, some of the informal cultural elements that have come up in past research as being particularly important, this notion of how we really do things around here, things like ethical leadership. So I said earlier I was going to mention this, especially at the supervisory level. So when we talk about ethical leadership, we're talking about leadership, a leader who is, who listens, who's open, who's trustworthy, who's principled, who makes good ethical decisions, who's fair, but who also kind of leads on ethics. So this is somebody who sets high standards and holds people accountable to them, and also role models ethical behavior. So it's not just tone at the top, it's that everyday supervisory behavior that's so important, and not abusive supervision, as I said earlier. It's the performance management system. People pay attention to what's rewarded and what's disciplined. That really matters. And some organizations do a really good job of incorporating ethics into their performance management system, and others kind of look at that and go, I don't have a clue how to do that. Fair treatment, the perception of fair treatment, safety to speak up, and this idea of a benevolent, caring climate, not one where everybody's just out for themselves.
And I think that's both the challenge and the opportunity for companies is how do you operationalize that? So how do you influence the informal systems without creating another formal system that just then adds, formal systems are good for a lot of reasons, the control piece, the signaling piece, but a lot of the things that we're trying to implement can't just be another formal system being put in place. It's really a lot of the discussions are around how do you influence those informal systems.
Okay, are there any questions before I get into the pilot? A little bit of results, yeah.
Has your research looked at anything, I know you said, and it makes sense about the ethical leadership with the supervision, that level, but what about, say, a board of directors or a CEO or president? Say your supervisor you see is very ethical, but you may not see that upper echelon as such. I would think that would make an impact, but have you pulled any of that data out and looked at it?
Yeah, I mean, obviously what works best is when both are seen as ethical leaders.
Right.
Dave and I actually have a paper where we demonstrate that it's even better if the coworkers are supportive too. So you have that, that social support coming from the top, coming from your supervisor, and coming from your coworkers. That's what works best. The way I think about executive leaders is that they are really important for a variety of reasons. One, they set the tone. We talk about tone at the top. They also provide resources. So we talked about how important the dean was earlier. You guys wouldn't exist and you wouldn't have the resources that you do unless you had a CEO who supported you to a certain extent and a board supported you to a certain extent. So to some extent it's that kind of thing. It's the things that they say. It's also the things that they do because people watch them, but they watch them from afar. So I've done a lot of research on ethical leadership, and their reputation is from afar. My supervisor, I know, right? And we deal with each other every single day. I see that person make decisions that affect me and the people that I care about, and that's why it's more important. Yes?
May I comment?
Sure.
It's more than just tone at the top. It's interested activity below from the people at the top. You don't get performance management systems which provide ethical connotations.
Absolutely.
Unless the guy at the top, or woman at the top, is very interested.
You're absolutely right.
And all of these items that you have here, it seems to me, having been at the top, gets their opportunity.
Absolutely.
For example, let's take that ethical leadership, especially supervisory level, non-abusive. If the man or woman at the top permits management by intimidation, then management by intimidation is going to occur throughout the organization. So my belief, and actually in the course I teach, it really is important, not tone, but
Action.
action all throughout.
Sure, absolutely. One of the things, however, I'll come back.
That's all right.
Have a little dialogue here. I have some other research where we found that sometimes, often actually, executives have a much rosier picture of the ethical culture and climate. And so they don't really understand what's going on. And that may be because they're not as engaged as they should be.
That's exactly right.
Right? So, yes. But it's, it's difficult to be engaged at all levels in a company like Brian's. It's huge. So it's a real challenge, I think, for very senior people to really, they have to really work hard to know what's going on throughout and at lower levels.
Absolutely.
If I can just add, I referred to it as the 3 A's. The first one is alignment, right? Formal and informal systems. The second one is action activity. Tone is not necessarily enough.
That's right.
Just being
You signify what's important by where you go and what you do.
and that brings on the third
What
one.
you say.
That brings on the third one, which is accountability, right? Making sure that accountability
Yeah.
is being driven.
Huge. Accountability is huge. Yes.
Quick point and quick question. First of all, for those of you who are in the business arena, I don't know if you realize who you have in front of you, Linda Trevino. She's, so to speak, the matriarch of business ethics in the academic world. I mean, literally. And you might not like having it put that way.
Yeah, I hate
Well,
that.
personally, I refer to her as a rock star.
I
As well as many of you. In my world, you're rock stars because you're really getting at the heart of, I think, of a big challenge with large organizations, whether it's for-profit, non-for-profit. I think we have the Army represented here. I'm sure you similar type of challenges.
Yeah.
I don't play guitar. African drumming, anybody? Okay.
If you ever find anything by Linda Trevino, pick it up because you will find it valuable. And it's been going for decades. This woman has been.
I am 90 years old. I just
Sorry,
really
that's my very good point. What's different in this assessment than the other assessments that are out there that consultants have been using? Because, well, anyway, is it that you're doing more on the informal side? Is that what I'm picking up, or what's the difference?
Well,
Because there are already a bunch of assessments out there.
yeah, that's a really good question. Let me get to talking a little bit about the pilot. Well, if we're
Actually, Linda, can I just answer very briefly to put this in context?
Yeah.
So, most companies are paying somebody to run an assessment. It tends to be a lot on engagement, other things. Sometimes there's some questions on ethics. There's not much on ethics. What we're trying to do is create a whole bunch of modules. And so Linda's telling us the very first module that we created, which is measuring employee perceptions on about 8 or 10 different constructs. So right now it's very big, and it's too big. But based on these results and then dozens of other companies, we're going to find out, what do you really need to know? I'm sure we won't need to measure these 8 constructs. It'll probably be just 2 to 4 eventually. So we're going to give you, first of all, better measurement, because this is going to be drawn from a much larger pool of questions that you need to know. Linda's telling you about one set of outcome measures, which is a very weak set, because it's basically just things we ask the very same employees about. This is just to get started. But later we'll have all kinds of more objective measures of good or bad ethical performance, or reputational measures from others. So this is going to be by far the most comprehensive program ever to look at using multiple assessment techniques. Using multiple assessment techniques, some implicit that you can't fake, others self-report. And then we'll find out empirically what actually matters, and then we'll narrow the set down. So we're going to produce much better measurement, and it's going to be free. And we're finding is that big companies all do it and pay a lot of money, small companies don't do it at all because they don't have the money. And so we're going to change that. We're going to change the world.
The other thing I would say is that that virtually all of these measures come from, they've been validated in previous research. And that, I think, has some value as well.
Can you go back to your slide on the survey, the questions that you...
Yes. So you want to...
That one.
The outcomes measured, exactly that.
Okay, the outcomes measure.
Really a question, this is really promoting ethical behavior, the positive side, not just the negative side of ethics or the compliance side. So I'm curious as to why or whether you considered observed ethical behavior, belief that employees would report positive ethical findings or speaking up about activities. In other words, the very soft things that you want to create so that you have a benchmark at time zero and you have a time series to see if you're moving the culture along the lines of where you want to go. So I just wonder how you thought about those kinds of measurements in this context.
That's a really good question and something that I think we ought to think more about. So obviously it's easier to ask, about the unethical behavior. We do ask some questions about, about reporting, about calling for not just to report things, but to ask for assistance, to ask for help. We ask about people's perceptions of ethical awareness in the organization, the fact that people seem to be aware, people seem to be, to feel morally efficacious, that they can actually act when they feel they should. So I think there are positives embedded in this. Was there something else?
I think that's a good point. But there are some, but I think you're right that we're not that balanced. And after Nick's talk about the importance of showing the beacons more, I think we do need to add a lot more on the positive.
It's the challenge.
You're trying to emphasize prize, if it's integrated into your incentive systems, if it's integrated into all of the aspects of an organization, then you want a growing awareness, ideally, of those things being evidenced, and your survey should.
Right, and we are asking things about, do you perceive that ethics is rewarded in the organization? So those are the more positive things.
And I would just add, I think this is where companies have a huge opportunity. We're human, we're natural, we tend to focus on the negative. And so driving a culture that accentuates the positive, really that focuses in, yes, we do need to talk about the things that happen in the organization that we want to change, but I think we have a huge opportunity to really put kind of the everyday decisions that happen. Our employees are making great decisions every day. We didn't get to be a $40 billion company operating in 100 countries around the world. We have a long history of integrity. But I think it's just kind of, it's almost natural. And so part of changing the culture is getting to that point. It's those beacons. It's kind of saying it doesn't go without saying. We actually need to say it, that people are making the right decisions. Our employees are making great decisions day in and day out. Let's amplify that within the organization.
So I think we need to get to the data and then have a few minutes to
right. I wanted to say one other thing, and I had exactly that same feeling. So I did a study a number of years ago where we asked people, and I think we have it incorporated in the larger survey now, question about your perception of whether what the company's doing around these issues is more for aspirational reasons because of who we are and who we want to be versus just kind of catching people doing the wrong thing. And what we found was that perception that the company's doing these things for aspirational reasons is actually pretty important. Yeah. Okay, so a little bit about the pilot test. This is in one organization, rather small organization. We have 165 employees and 34 managers represented in the data that I'm going to present you, and it's just a little bit of data just to give you a taste and the data came in like within the last week, so we haven't really had a chance to do a whole lot with it. What I'm showing you here are just some means and looking at a number of the things we measured for divided up by employees and managers who were combined with executives, because there were just a couple of executives who filled out the survey. And What we found, interestingly, was that there were no significant differences between the employees and the managers. This is something that you might want to look for if you were doing this in your own organization. So our managers kind of in touch with, you know, are their perceptions similar to the employee perceptions? And this is good news, that in this organization there were no significant differences between how the employees perceive the organization and how their managers perceive the organization's ethics.
And also just note that the means are very high. I mean,
The
on all
means
those,
are
on all
very
those
high.
positive traits.
Very,
Because-
very positive. On a 7-point scale, a lot of these are quite high. You want, obviously, misconduct to be low. You want abusive supervision to be low. The one I guess I would be maybe a little more concerned about is self-interested ethical climate. So that's a measure that asks questions like, in this organization, everybody's sort of out for themselves. So that's the only one, if I were in this organization, I'd be perhaps a little paying attention to anyway. So what we did was, so we ran a lot of just correlations, and I can show you those, but this is a result of a regression analysis, which just shows you what some of the biggest contributors were to overall misconduct. So we talked earlier about how important perceptions of fairness are. We talked about benevolent ethical climate, so that's the opposite of the self-interested climate. This is where people are thought to care about each other, take care of each other. Supervisory ethical leadership, very important, and abusive supervision on the negative side, very important. We also have on the right column just some examples of the kinds of very specific behaviors that were measured in this organization and the ones that were most important for these particular variables. So you can look at those. I don't think I want to read those to you. If you have any questions, we can answer those.
Can you,
Why don't we just, we have only 4 minutes left, so why don't we just finish up and then.
Yes. Okay. Questions?
This supervisory leadership, what was that measured again?
So that's ethical leadership at the supervisory level. Okay. So what do we know? We know that perceived fairness matters a lot. And I always quote somebody, his name was Kent Dragestein, who I believe was the very first ethics officer. You remember him? Yeah, okay. What a great guy, right? He was a really wonderful ethics officer at Texas Instruments, and he said to me, when you say ethics, employees hear fairness. And I never forgot that. It's a very powerful statement, and it has come up in every single study. Other things matter too. So these other things that we just talked about. Employee perceptions can tell you a lot, and they can be easily assessed. And in this sample, they pretty closely match management perceptions, which is a good thing. I said, in a larger organization, you'd want to separate it out more senior people and look at whether they see it as rosier or whether they really have a good handle on perceptions in the organization. So, any other, we have
2 minutes.
2 minutes for any other questions? Yeah.
I just want to make sure I understand the correlations in that previous slide. Were we saying that post the survey, there was misconduct, that you could go back and say these people either rated the fairness low or high? Is that what we're saying?
So what we're saying is that perceived fairness was powerful in predicting those specific kinds of misconduct.
But it was perceptions of those misconduct. So again, it's a very weak measure because it's all from the same people.
Right.
But it's just to go through the motions of the analysis at this point.
it's perception, you're not.
Yes,
It is
correct.
perception.
Later
of
we'll have
observed
reality.
misconduct. So
But
they're
for now, we
not,
just have perception.
they're not self-reporting that I did this. They're saying, that I've seen this in my organization in the last year. I have observed this in my organization in the last year. And to the extent that they perceive the organization to treat people fairly, they'd be less likely to see those sorts of.
But that is interesting, right? Because if you then take this survey and you score fairly high, because it looked like that it was a fairly decent, mostly
Right.
high, mid-fives, but, and you get a low score on super, you know to look out for personal use of company material, padding and expense, like.
Yeah, and it kind of makes sense that if you don't have strong ethical leaders at the supervisory level, that you might have more expense account padding problems. It sort of makes sense, but it gives you, some tools. It gives you some information that you can take and then use. You can also look at the data to divide, if you have a large organization, you could look at units within the organization and see whether there are big differences in perceptions of supervisory ethical leadership, for example, in different units of the organization. Then you know you need to target that unit. And that other unit, needs to get a letter that says, hey, you did great.
We have time for one more question.
Yes.
I'd be interested in how many survey items are there? I mean, in the Army, we have survey fatigue.
Yes, so I wanted to say something about that. So survey fatigue is huge. We worked so hard because as academics, we always want more items. And as survey fatigued human beings, you want fewer items. I think we got this down to 15 minutes? 10 minutes. No, that's right, 10 minutes. Yep, 10 minutes. So this is a survey that can be, now I don't think we included everything.
No.
Yeah.
70 questions.
Yeah, so, but people were able to complete it in 10 minutes and the response rate was good. So my sense, I have this intuitive sense, I haven't tested it, but if you tell people that they can do it in 10 minutes, they'll do it. If it's gonna take a lot longer than that, you're gonna lose them, right?
And I think we're going to get it down to 20 or 30 items. Right now it's around 50 or 60 items total, but this is the very first pass. I think we're going to, based on what we've learned here, we're going to get this down to 20 or 30 items. And then we'll have a lot of other modules if you want to go in depth with a small subset, but we'll have a core module that we would give out to all your members.
Yeah, and I think companies can make choices. So they could choose, for example, to ask about all those very specific kinds of misconduct or not, right? Just ask the overall misconduct question. But you learn different things, and then you have different tools to work with. Thank you.